The cargo container sat in the corner of the storage bay, covered in warning labels that nobody bothered to read anymore. Hosk had worked security on Horizon's gate station for 12 years, and in that time, he had seen thousands of containers, marked dangerous, that contained nothing more threatening than expired food or broken equipment. His species, the Veltrans, were known for being careful and methodical, but even Hosk had grown tired of checking every single box that came through. The container from Drakmore 7 had arrived 3 days ago. It was supposed to stay in frozen storage, kept at temperatures cold enough to stop biological processes completely. But the station was running on a tight budget, and the cooling system in Bay 7 had been malfunctioning for weeks. Nobody had bothered to fix it, because Bay 7 mostly stored junk that nobody wanted anyway. Hosk noticed the temperature gauge first. It was reading 15 degrees above freezing when it should have been reading -40. He swore in his native language and walked over to check the container. The metal was warm to the touch. That was wrong. That was very wrong. Inside the container, 3 eggs that had been dormant for months were warming up. The embryos inside, designed by millions of years of evolution to survive on one of the harshest worlds in the galaxy, sensed the change in temperature. Their hearts started beating. Their lungs started forming. Their claws started hardening. Within an hour, cracks appeared on the surface of the eggs. Hosk heard the first crack and froze. He had heard many sounds in his career, but this was different. This was the sound of something alive, something that wanted out. He reached for his communicator to call for backup, but before his fingers touched the button, the container exploded outward. 3 creatures burst into the bay, their scales still wet from the eggs, their eyes wild and confused. They were each the size of a large dog, but their teeth were already as long as Hosk's fingers. Their claws scraped against the metal floor, leaving deep gouges. They looked around the bright, noisy bay and did what any scared predator would do. They attacked. Hosk ran. He was not ashamed of this. Veltrans were smart enough to know when they were outmatched. He slammed his hand on the emergency button as he sprinted toward the exit, and sirens began wailing throughout the entire station. Behind him, he could hear the hatchlings shrieking and the sound of metal being torn apart. The station had protocols for dangerous situations. Within minutes, security teams were suiting up and loading their weapons. The Chitara guards grabbed their plasma rifles. The Grandar soldiers activated their energy shields. Everyone assumed this would be quick and clean. Dangerous animals were always quick and clean to deal with when you had superior technology and numbers. They were wrong. The first security team entered Bay 7 with confidence. They had stun weapons, nets, and enough firepower to stop a charging Grandar if necessary. What they found instead were 3 hatchlings that moved faster than their eyes could track. The creatures worked together like they had been planning this their whole lives. Even though they were only an hour old, one would distract from the front while another attacked from the side. The third would circle around and cut off the escape route. Plasma bolts missed their targets. Stun nets caught nothing but air. The energy shields held against the claws, but the hatchlings learned quickly. They stopped attacking the shields and started attacking the exposed legs and arms instead. Within 5 minutes, the first security team was in full retreat, carrying 2 injured members. Captain Breck, the station commander, watched the security footage with growing horror. His species, the Ulith, had been dealing with dangerous creatures for thousands of years. They had protocols and procedures for everything. But these protocols assumed the creatures would behave in predictable ways. These hatchlings were not predictable. He ordered a lockdown of the entire section. Heavy blast doors slammed shut, sealing off Bay 7 and the surrounding corridors. The hatchlings were trapped in a space roughly the size of 4 city blocks, filled with storage containers, equipment, and unfortunately, ventilation shafts large enough for them to crawl through. The second security team tried using tranquilizer darts. The darts bounced off the hardening scales like pebbles off armor. The third team tried sonic weapons that were supposed to disorient any creature with a functioning ear. The hatchlings seemed to find the noise annoying at worst. The fourth team tried deploying sleeping gas. The hatchlings held their breath longer than any Earth creature could, and simply waited for the gas to disperse. By the end of the first day, 17 people were in the medical bay with injuries ranging from deep cuts to broken bones. 43 more had minor injuries. The hatchlings had claimed an entire section of the station and showed no signs of calming down. Worse, they had made a nest in the environmental control systems. Cutting power to that section would kill thousands of residents by shutting down their air recycling. Captain Breck contacted the Galactic Wildlife Control Bureau. The specialist on the other end of the call listened to his description of the situation and was quiet for a long moment before speaking. The specialist explained that Drakmor razorbacks were classified as Class 5 apex predators. They were intelligent, adaptable, and extremely dangerous even as hatchlings. The specialist estimated it would take 3 weeks to assemble a team capable of handling them safely. Breck pointed out that the station did not have 3 weeks. The specialist expressed sympathy but explained there was simply no one closer who had the training and equipment necessary. Breck ended the call and stared at the security monitors showing 3 dragon-like creatures prowling through darkened corridors, occasionally shrieking challenges at the cameras. In the lower residential section of the station, a human maintenance worker named Roy Fisher was watching the same news feeds that everyone else was watching. He had lived on Horizon's Gate for 8 months, fixing broken equipment and patching leaking pipes. Most of the aliens on the station barely noticed him. Humans were still new to the galactic community, and most species did not know what to make of them yet. Roy studied the footage carefully. He watched how the hatchlings moved, how they reacted to threats, how they protected each other. He had seen this behavior before, just not on alien creatures. Back on Earth, he had worked with wolves, bears, and mountain lions. He had spent years learning how predators think, how they communicate, how they decide what is dangerous and what is safe. What he saw on the screen were not monsters. They were scared babies in a strange place, surrounded by creatures they did not understand, defending themselves the only way they knew how. Every species on the station was trying to fight them or capture them. Nobody was trying to understand them. Roy looked at his small kitchen and thought about what he had in his refrigerator. He had some synthesized meat that he had bought from the station market. He had bread. He had spices from Earth that he used to make his food taste like home. He thought about the sandwich he had been planning to make for dinner. Then he thought about 3 terrified hatchlings who had never known kindness, only fear and violence. He made a decision that everyone would later say was completely insane. He was going to walk into that sealed section, unarmed and alone with nothing but a sandwich. He was going to show those hatchlings that not everything in this metal world wanted to hurt them. Roy stood up and started preparing his sandwich very carefully. Roy had never planned to leave Earth. Growing up on a ranch in Montana, he had imagined spending his entire life working with animals in wide open spaces under familiar skies. But when humanity made first contact with alien civilizations, everything changed. The galaxy opened up, and with it came opportunities that nobody on Earth had ever dreamed possible. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center where Roy worked had been struggling financially for years. When the job posting appeared for maintenance workers on interstellar stations, the pay was 10 times what he made caring for injured predators. Roy told himself he would work in space for a few years, save money, and return home to buy his own land. That was 8 months ago, and he still was not sure he had made the right choice. Life on Horizon's Gate was lonely. Most alien species looked at humans with curiosity at best and dismissal at worst. Earth was considered a barely developed world, and humans were seen as weak creatures from a planet that had only just figured out faster than light travel. Roy fixed pipes and recycling units while aliens with advanced degrees walked past him without acknowledgement. He missed home. He missed working with animals that he understood. Now watching the security footage of 3 dragon hatchlings tearing through trained security teams, Roy felt something he had not felt in months. He felt useful. He understood what was happening on those screens in a way that nobody else on the station seemed to. He went to see Captain Breck in the command center. The Ulith commander was surrounded by advisors, all of them shouting suggestions that contradicted each other. Some wanted to use heavier weapons. Others wanted to wait for the specialists. A few were suggesting they evacuate the entire section and vent it to space, though everyone knew that would kill thousands of residents. Roy waited until there was a pause in the argument. Then he cleared his throat and said he had a solution. The room went quiet. Captain Breck looked at him with tired eyes that had not seen sleep in over 30 hours. He asked what possible solution a human maintenance worker could offer that trained security forces had not already tried. Roy explained that everyone was approaching the problem wrong. They were treating the hatchlings like enemy combatants or malfunctioning machines, but the hatchlings were not attacking because they were evil or broken. They were attacking because they were terrified. They had hatched in a strange place, surrounded by strange smells and sounds and creatures. Every being they encountered either ran away or attacked them. They had learned that violence was the only language anyone here spoke. Captain Breck listened with an expression that suggested he was only being polite. He pointed out that 12 separate security teams had failed to stop these creatures. What made Roy think he could succeed where trained soldiers had failed? Roy said he did not plan to stop them. He planned to talk to them. He was going to approach them unarmed, with nothing but food, and show them that not everything on this station was a threat. The room erupted in protests. Several advisors said this was suicide. Others said it was a waste of time. One Chitara officer said that humans clearly did not value their own lives appropriately, but Captain Breck held up his hand for silence. He asked Roy to explain his reasoning. Roy talked about Earth, about how humans had spent thousands of years living alongside dangerous predators. Humans had survived by learning to understand these creatures, not just fear them. They domesticated wolves by feeding them and showing patience. They trained birds of prey by earning their trust. They kept animals that could kill them easily, and they did it through respect and consistency, not force. The concept was alien to most species in the room. When the Chitara encountered dangerous predators on their homeworld, they built walls and weapons. When the Grandar faced threats, they used their superior strength to dominate. The idea of approaching danger with patience and food seemed absurd, but Captain Breck was desperate. 3 weeks was too long to wait. The station was already seeing economic losses from the lockdown. Residents were panicking. He asked Roy what he needed. Roy said he needed information about the hatchlings' biology, and he needed access to the sealed section. Nothing else. Dr. Wex, the station's head veterinarian, provided what information she had on Drakmor razorbacks. They were obligate carnivores with extremely acute senses. They were highly intelligent and formed strong social bonds within their clutch. They had likely been separated from their parent shortly after the eggs were laid, which meant they had no adult to teach them how to behave. Everything they knew came from instinct and the traumatic experience of hatching on a hostile station. Dr. Wex also told Roy that his chances of survival were approximately 4%. She said this not to discourage him, but because she believed he deserved to know the truth. Roy thanked her and said he had faced worse odds working with grizzly bears. This was not entirely true, but he appreciated her concern. Roy spent 2 hours preparing his approach. He needed food that would appeal to predators but would not trigger a feeding frenzy. He took synthesized meat that was chemically similar to prey species from Drakmor 7. He added spices from Earth, things like garlic and rosemary that enhanced the natural meat scent. He wrapped everything carefully in a way that would require the hatchlings to work for it, engaging their problem-solving instincts. Other maintenance workers watched him prepare the sandwich with expressions of confusion and pity. They thought he was insane. Maybe he was. But Roy had learned long ago that the line between bravery and insanity was often invisible until after the outcome was known. He changed into his normal work coveralls. No armor, no weapons, nothing that would make him seem like a threat. He clipped the sandwich container to his belt and walked toward the sealed section. Captain Breck had given him a communicator with a direct line to the command center. Security teams were standing by, ready to intervene if things went wrong, though everyone knew they would not be fast enough to save him if the hatchlings attacked immediately. The blast door opened just wide enough for Roy to slip through, then sealed behind him with a heavy clang that echoed through the empty corridor. Roy was alone in the sealed section now, with 3 apex predators somewhere in the darkness ahead. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. His hands were sweating. Every instinct humans had developed over millions of years of evolution was screaming at him to run. But Roy had spent his entire adult life ignoring those instincts. He started walking deeper into the section, toward the environmental control center where the hatchlings had made their nest. As he walked, he talked quietly to himself. Not words that mattered, but just a calm, steady sound. Tone mattered more than content when dealing with scared animals. The lights in this section were dimmed to save power. Shadows stretched across the floor and walls. Roy could see claw marks on the metal surfaces, deep gouges that showed just how powerful these creatures were. He could smell something too. A sharp animal scent mixed with the metallic tang of blood. Some of that blood belonged to security officers who had tried to capture the hatchlings. Roy tried not to think about that. He rounded a corner and saw 3 pairs of glowing amber eyes watching him from the darkness. The hatchlings were larger than the reports had suggested. Each was easily 150 pounds of muscle and scales and teeth. They were crouched in a defensive triangle protecting each other's backs, tails lashing against the floor. Roy stopped walking. He did not run. He did not reach for a weapon he did not have. He simply stood there for a moment, letting the hatchlings see that he was not attacking. Then very slowly he sat down cross-legged on the cold metal floor. He took out his sandwich and began to eat it, his movements calm and deliberate. He did not look directly at the hatchlings. Direct eye contact was a challenge to most predators. The hatchlings watched him with confusion. This was new behavior. This creature was not running away. It was not attacking. It was just sitting there, eating something that smelled interesting. The smallest hatchling, the one with a white patch on her snout, took a half-step forward. Her siblings hissed a warning, but curiosity was already winning over caution. Roy tore off a piece of his sandwich and placed it on the floor between himself and the hatchlings. Then he scooted backward several feet. He kept eating his portion, showing that the food was safe. The white-patched hatchling looked at her siblings, then at the food, then at Roy. After a long, tense moment, she darted forward, snatched the food, and retreated to safety. Roy watched as the hatchling's entire body language changed. The food tasted right in a way that nothing else on this station had. For the first time since hatching in this nightmare place, something made sense. She swallowed and made a small chirping sound. Her siblings tensed, ready to defend her, but she was not in distress. She was interested. Roy smiled and placed another piece of food on the floor. 20 minutes passed in near silence. Roy sat on the floor of the Environmental Control Center, methodically tearing off small pieces of his sandwich and placing them on the ground. Each time he moved the food a little closer to where he sat, and each time he backed away a little less. The white-patched hatchling was the first to take the risk, but her siblings watched every movement with intense focus. The largest hatchling, the one with deep crimson scales, was clearly the protective one. Every time the white-patched hatchling moved toward Roy, the crimson one shifted position to keep himself between them, ready to attack if this strange creature proved dangerous. The smallest hatchling, with scales that shimmered blue-black like oil on water, was the most cautious. She watched everything but stayed back, analyzing the situation before committing. Roy understood pack dynamics. He had worked with wolf packs back on Earth, and the patterns were similar across species. There was always a bold one who tested boundaries, a protective one who defended the group, and a smart one who observed and learned. These 3 had survived their first day on the station by working together, using their natural instincts to compensate for their lack of experience. In the command center, hundreds of beings watched the security feeds in stunned silence. Captain Breck had expected this to end in seconds, with Roy either running for his life or being killed. Instead, he was watching a human feed deadly predators like they were pets. Dr. Wex was recording everything, her scientific mind already racing with questions about human psychology and animal behavior. The white-patched hatchling finished another piece of food and did not retreat this time. She sat down, her tail curled around her feet, and stared at Roy with those unsettling amber eyes. Roy knew this was a critical moment. He reached into his container and pulled out a larger piece of meat. But instead of placing it on the ground, he held it in his open palm, arm extended. The hatchling looked at the food, then at Roy's face, then back at the food. Her siblings made warning sounds, low rumbles that vibrated through the floor. But the hatchling was young and hungry and tired of being afraid. She crept forward, her claws clicking against the metal, until she was close enough that Roy could feel her breath on his hand. Her snout was warm and scaled, with small spines beginning to develop along the ridge. She sniffed Roy's hand carefully, taking in his scent along with the food. For a moment, Roy thought she might bite his fingers off. His hand trembled slightly despite his best efforts to stay calm. The hatchling noticed the tremor and pulled back, uncertain. Roy took a slow breath and steadied his hand. He kept his eyes focused on a point past the hatchling's shoulder, not making direct eye contact. He kept his voice low and steady as he murmured nonsense words, the same tone he had used with frightened animals on Earth. The hatchling tilted her head, processing this new information. Then she leaned forward and gently took the food from his palm. The touch was brief but significant. Her mouth was surprisingly careful, her teeth never scraping his skin. She took only the food and backed away to eat it. Roy let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Behind him, he heard a small sound and turned his head slowly to find the blue-black hatchling had circled around while he was focused on her sister. She was smarter than he had given her credit for. Roy smiled and held out another piece of food toward the blue-black hatchling. She approached from the side, moving with liquid grace that suggested she would be terrifyingly fast when fully grown. She took the food even more carefully than her sister had, her eyes never leaving Roy's face. He could see intelligence there, real thinking beyond just instinct. This one was going to be trouble in the best possible way. The crimson hatchling watched his siblings eat from the strange creature's hand and made a decision. If his clutchmates were safe, then perhaps he was missing an opportunity. He approached directly from the front. No sneaking or caution, just straightforward acceptance of the new situation. Roy offered him food and the crimson hatchling took it, with what could only be described as dignity. Over the next hour, Roy established a pattern that would become the foundation of everything that followed. Food was given freely but required calm behavior. Aggression meant Roy turned away and stopped offering. Patience meant more food and eventually, something the hatchlings had not experienced since leaving their egg, gentle touch. The first time Roy reached out to stroke the white-patched hatchling's head, she froze completely. Her siblings tensed, ready to defend her, but Roy's hand was warm and his touch was gentle, scratching behind the small horn nubs beginning to grow on her skull. The hatchling made a sound that Roy had never heard before, a deep, thrumming purr that seemed to come from her entire body. By the end of the second day, all three hatchlings allowed Roy to touch them. He learned their personalities quickly. The white-patched one, who he started calling Ash because of the pale marking on her nose, was brave and curious. She was always the first to try new things, the first to approach when Roy arrived, the first to demand attention. The crimson one became Red in Roy's mind, a simple name for a straightforward personality. Red was protective and loyal, always watching for threats, always positioning himself to defend his siblings. The blue-black hatchling took longer to earn trust, but once she decided Roy was safe, she revealed a playful intelligence that delighted him. He called her Midnight because her scales seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She was the one who figured out how to open the containers Roy brought, the one who learned to anticipate his movements, the one who would grow up to be devastatingly clever. The station slowly began to believe that maybe, impossibly, Roy's insane plan was working. Security teams stopped preparing for extraction and started preparing for something they had never considered: coexistence. Captain Breck reviewed the footage of Roy sitting peacefully with three creatures that had terrorized trained soldiers, and felt something shift in his understanding of humans. But Roy knew that trust was only the first step. These hatchlings were growing fast, eating massive amounts of food each day, and their instincts were still wild and unpredictable. Teaching them to be safe around other species would require more than just patience. It would require training, boundaries, and consequences. It would require treating them not as pets to be controlled, but as intelligent beings capable of learning and choosing better behaviors. On the third day, Roy brought more than just food. He brought toys, puzzle feeders, and enrichment activities he designed based on his experience with Earth predators. The hatchlings needed mental stimulation as much as physical nourishment. Ash immediately attacked a rubber ball with enthusiastic violence. Red investigated a puzzle box that required manipulation to open, his problem-solving skills emerging. Midnight watched both activities, learned from her siblings' attempts, then solved her puzzle box in half the time. Dr. Wex visited the sealed section for the first time since the incident began. She stayed behind a reinforced barrier while Roy worked with the hatchlings, but she was close enough to make observations that excited her scientific curiosity. She watched Red bring food to Ash when the smaller hatchling was tired. She watched Midnight share her puzzle box with Red when he got frustrated. She watched all three hatchlings orient themselves around Roy, like he was the center of their world. When Dr. Wex returned to the command center, she told Captain Breck something that would change interspecies relations across the galaxy. These hatchlings were not tamed. They were not controlled. They were bonded. The difference was crucial. Taming implied breaking an animal's spirit until it obeyed out of fear. Bonding meant earning trust until the animal chose to cooperate. Humans, she theorized, had developed this ability because their homeworld forced them to. Earth was dangerous, but humans survived by making allies of their predators rather than enemies. Captain Breck asked the question that everyone was thinking. Could Roy keep them? Could a single human really take responsibility for 3 Drakmor Razorbacks? Dr. Wex said she did not know, but she believed that if anyone could do it, it would be a human. And probably specifically this human, who had walked unarmed into certain death armed only with a sandwich and a lifetime of patience. Roy did not hear this conversation. He was too busy teaching Midnight not to bite the cables in the Environmental Control Center. 3 weeks after the incident began, Roy Fisher stood in Captain Breck's office and said words that made the Ulith commander question the sanity of all humans. Roy wanted to keep the hatchlings permanently, not temporarily while they waited for wildlife control, not until they found a proper facility, but forever. He wanted to claim legal guardianship of 3 apex predators that would each grow to weigh over 1,000 pounds. Captain Breck stared at him in silence for a full minute. Then he asked if Earth had parasites that affected human judgment, because this was the only explanation that made sense. Roy laughed and said no. Humans were just comfortable with risk in ways that other species were not. He explained that back on Earth, people kept animals far more dangerous than these hatchlings. Bears, big cats, venomous snakes. The key was respect, training, and never forgetting what these creatures were capable of. The Galactic Wildlife Preservation Council exploded with objections. They filed 17 separate complaints, each citing regulations that prohibited keeping Class 5 predators in civilian custody. The Pillaran Medical Association declared Roy mentally unstable, though they had never examined him. A coalition of concerned citizens from 20 different species demanded the station refuse his request for everyone's safety. But Roy had a simple counter-argument. Either he kept the hatchlings or they would be euthanized. No zoo had facilities for Drakmor Razorbacks. No conservation program could return them to the wild, since they had imprinted on technology and artificial environments. Wildlife Control's only solution was lethal injection, followed by cremation. Roy asked if the council preferred 3 dead babies or 3 living ones under his care. The debate raged for days. Dr. Wex supported Roy, presenting data showing the hatchlings' progress under his guidance. Captain Breck, despite his reservations, admitted that Roy had accomplished what trained security forces could not. Even Scrix, the Chitara security team leader who had initially called Roy's plan suicidal, grudgingly testified that the human seemed to know what he was doing. Finally, the council voted. Roy could keep the hatchlings under strict conditions. He would be fully responsible for any damage they caused. He would provide regular health and behavioral assessments. And he would prove within 6 months that the hatchlings could coexist peacefully with other station residents. Or they would be seized and dealt with according to standard dangerous animal protocols. Roy agreed to every condition. He knew the real challenge was just beginning. Trust was one thing. Training was another. The hatchlings were already over 300 pounds each and still growing. Their natural instincts were to hunt, defend territory, and establish dominance. Roy needed to channel those instincts into acceptable behaviors before someone got hurt. He started with basic commands: sit, stay, come. The same words humans had used to train dogs for thousands of years. The hatchlings learned quickly, but not out of submission. They learned because Roy made training into a game with food rewards and praise. Ash learned fastest because she loved attention. Red learned because he trusted Roy completely. Midnight learned because she enjoyed solving the puzzle of what Roy wanted. The harder lesson was teaching them that other beings were not threats or prey. Roy brought volunteers into the sealed section, starting with people who were comfortable around dangerous animals. Dr. Wex was first, staying calm while 3 dragon-sized predators sniffed her with intense curiosity. A Grondar engineer named Torv came next, his massive size making him less intimidating to the hatchlings than smaller species. Each successful interaction earned rewards. Each aggressive display meant training stopped immediately. The hatchlings learned that calm behavior around others meant good things happened. Aggressive behavior meant Roy walked away, taking his attention and food with him. For creatures that had bonded so strongly with Roy, his disapproval was a powerful motivator. But theory and practice were different things. Roy knew the real test would come when they left the sealed section and entered areas with normal station traffic. He spent weeks preparing for this moment, gradually increasing the number of visitors, introducing new sounds and smells, desensitizing the hatchlings to chaos. When Roy finally told Captain Breck he wanted to walk the hatchlings through the main plaza, the commander nearly refused. The plaza was the heart of the station, with thousands of people passing through every hour. One mistake could cause a panic. One aggressive move could result in deaths. Captain Breck said he would allow it only if every security team was on standby, and the plaza was cleared of children and vulnerable species. Roy agreed, but insisted the security teams stay out of sight. Visible weapons would make the hatchlings defensive. He also refused to clear the plaza. The whole point was teaching the hatchlings that crowds were normal and non-threatening. After hours of argument, they compromised. The walk would happen during mid-cycle when traffic was moderate but not overwhelming. Security would stay hidden unless needed, and Roy would wear a communication device with an emergency shutoff word that would trigger immediate intervention. The day of the walk, over 5,000 beings found reasons to be near the plaza. Some were curious. Some were worried. Many were there to witness what they assumed would be a disaster. Roy arrived with Ash, Red, and Midnight wearing simple harnesses he had designed. The harnesses were not restraints. The hatchlings could break them easily if they wanted. They were reminders of structure, physical cues that training was active. Roy walked calmly into the plaza, and the hatchlings followed in formation. Red on his left, protective and watchful. Midnight on his right, observing everything with sharp intelligence. Ash slightly ahead, her curiosity barely contained but her training holding. The crowd pressed against windows and barriers, watching with held breath. They made it halfway across the plaza without incident. The hatchlings were nervous, their heads swiveling to track movement, their tails lashing slightly. But they stayed with Roy, trusting his calm confidence. Then a young Chitara child, no more than 5 years old, broke free from her parents' grip and ran toward the hatchlings with a delighted squeal. Time seemed to slow. The child's parent screamed. Security reached for weapons. Red's head snapped toward the sudden movement, his muscles tensing to defend against what his instincts read as an attack. The entire plaza held its breath, certain they were about to witness tragedy. Roy gave a single sharp whistle. All 3 hatchlings immediately sat, a behavior they had practiced thousands of times until it was automatic. Red froze mid-motion, his training overriding instinct. Ash, who had started to turn toward the sound, dropped into a sitting position. Midnight sat so fast she nearly fell over. Roy walked calmly to the child, who was now standing frozen halfway between her parent and the hatchlings, confused by the sudden tension. He picked her up gently, smiled at her terrified parent, and carried the child back to safety. Then he returned to the hatchlings, knelt beside them, and praised them with words and scratches. They had done exactly what they were supposed to do. The plaza erupted in chatter. Security teams relaxed. The child's parent, once the shock wore off, thanked Roy with tears in her eyes. Captain Breck, watching from the command center, sat back in his chair and allowed himself to believe that maybe this impossible situation might actually work. Roy completed the walk without further incident. By the time he returned to his quarters, messages were flooding his communication device. Vendors who had previously avoided him were offering free food for the hatchlings. Scientists wanted to study his training methods. Parents were pointing out the hatchlings to their children as examples of how patients could solve impossible problems. But Roy knew this was just one successful walk. The real work was far from over. The hatchlings were still growing, still learning, still wild creatures at their core. Every day would require vigilance, consistency, and the understanding that one mistake could undo everything. The hatchlings were 5 months old when Roy realized he could not keep them on the station much longer. Ash, Red, and Midnight were now each over 600 pounds and still growing rapidly. Roy's quarters, already small by human standards, were impossibly cramped for 3 dragon-sized predators. They could barely turn around without knocking over furniture. Their food requirements had increased to nearly 100 pounds per day combined, draining Roy's savings faster than he could earn. But the space issue was not the real problem. The real problem was that the hatchlings needed more than training exercises and walks through corridors. They needed to run, to hunt, to use their bodies the way evolution had designed them. Keeping them confined was starting to affect their behavior. Red was becoming restless and irritable. Midnight had started stress pacing at night. Even Ash, usually cheerful and playful, seemed depressed. Roy spent his evenings researching options. Zoos would not take them. Conservation programs did not want them. Most worlds considered Drakmor razorbacks too dangerous for private ownership. Then he discovered something called the Frontier Claim Act, a piece of galactic law that allowed individuals to claim uninhabited worlds for settlement. The process was surprisingly simple in theory. Find an unclaimed world, verify it met basic habitability requirements, pay the filing fee, and submit the paperwork. In practice, most desirable worlds were already claimed. What remained were planets that nobody wanted. Death worlds with toxic atmospheres, ice worlds with no resources, jungle worlds with diseases that killed most known species. Roy searched through the database of unclaimed worlds, looking for something that could support him and 3 massive predators. He needed breathable air, available water, and enough space that the hatchlings could be themselves without threatening anyone. After weeks of searching, he found it. FP7739, locally called Frost Vale. The database entry was not encouraging. Frost Vale was a cold world with long winters and short growing seasons. The native megafauna were large and aggressive. The terrain was described as unforgiving. Average temperature stayed below freezing for 8 months of the year. Most species considered it barely habitable and commercially worthless. Roy read the description and smiled. It sounded like Montana, only bigger and with more dangerous wildlife. He checked his savings. The claim filing fee was 10,000 credits. He had 11,000 saved from his maintenance work. He submitted the claim application before he could talk himself out of it. The Galactic Settlement Bureau assigned his case to a Veltran named Hesk, who spent their first conversation trying to understand why anyone would voluntarily move to Frost Vale. Roy explained his plan to build a sanctuary for dangerous creatures that had nowhere else to go. Hask listened with an expression that suggested he thought Roy was suffering from oxygen deprivation, but processed the claim anyway. Word of Roy's plan spread through Horizon's Gate within days. The reactions were mixed. Some thought he was giving up on civilized life to play hermit on an ice ball. Others thought he was building something important. To everyone's surprise, people started offering to help. Dr. Wex donated medical equipment and veterinary supplies worth more than Roy's annual salary. She said it was for research purposes, but Roy suspected she had grown fond of the hatchlings, despite her scientific detachment. The Grandar engineering team volunteered to help construct initial habitats, saying they had nothing better to do during their off-cycles. Even Captain Breck contributed, arranging for discounted transport and waiving station fees Roy still owed. The transport to Frost Vale was arranged through a cargo company willing to modify one of their haulers. The trip would take 3 weeks, and Roy would need to stay with the hatchlings the entire time. The transport crew thought this was unnecessarily risky until they saw how the hatchlings behaved around Roy. Red positioned himself between Roy and any crew member who approached. Midnight shadowed Roy constantly, as if worried he might disappear. Ash simply refused to let Roy out of her sight for more than a few minutes. The journey was long and uncomfortable. Roy slept in a hammock strung between cargo containers while the hatchlings nested on insulated mats nearby. He talked to them, constantly, reassuring them that the strange noises and movements were normal. He played games with them to prevent boredom. He maintained their training routines even in the cramped cargo hold. The transport crew gradually relaxed as they watched Roy work. They had never seen anyone interact with dangerous animals the way he did. No fear, but also no foolish confidence. Just calm, consistent attention to behavior and body language. The captain, a gruff Eulith named Brem, admitted privately that humans might have talents other species had overlooked. Frost Vale appeared, in the view screen like a pearl of white and blue against black space. Ice covered much of the northern and southern regions. Dark forests spread across the temperate zones. Mountain ranges cut through continents like the spines of sleeping giants. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. The landing was rough. Frostvale's atmosphere created turbulence that rattled the entire ship. Roy held onto support beams while the hatchlings braced themselves, their claws leaving deep scores in the metal deck. When the ship finally touched down, everything went still. Roy could hear wind howling outside the hull. The cargo door opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Cold air rushed in, carrying scents of ice and stone and growing things. Roy stepped out first, his breath fogging in the freezing temperature. The hatchlings followed cautiously, their claws crunching on frost-covered ground. Ash was the first to truly leave the ship. She stepped onto alien soil and froze, her nostrils flaring as she processed 1,000 new scents. Then she spread her wings, still too small to lift her massive body, and made a sound Roy had never heard before. It was a cry of joy mixed with challenge, announcing her presence to this new world. Red and Midnight joined her, their voices creating a chorus that echoed off distant mountains. For the first time in their lives, the hatchlings were truly free. No walls, no corridors, no restrictions except the ones Roy taught them. They ran through the snow, kicking up clouds of white powder, wrestling with each other like the babies they still were. Roy watched them play and felt certainty settle in his chest. This was right. This was what they needed. The first months were brutal. Roy lived in a prefab shelter barely large enough for one person while he built proper structures. The work was backbreaking. Frostvale's megafauna tested his defenses regularly. Creatures that looked like six-legged bears tried to raid his supplies. Pack hunters resembling wolves made of ice and fury circled his camp at night. Roy learned to hunt native prey to supplement the hatchlings' diet when his supplies ran low. But the hatchlings thrived in ways they never had on the station. They grew stronger, faster, more confident. Red became a skilled hunter, his patient stalking technique bringing down prey twice his size. Midnight proved to have an uncanny sense for weather patterns, always knowing when storms were coming. Ash developed into the pack's scout, ranging far ahead to check for dangers and opportunities. They also became even more protective of Roy. When he fell ill from a local infection, the hatchlings refused to leave his side for 5 days. Red caught extra prey and brought it to the shelter entrance. Midnight's body heat kept Roy warm when his heating system failed. Ash stood guard outside, attacking anything that approached with hostile intent. They saved his life through pure, stubborn loyalty. Dr. Wex visited after 6 months, representing the Galactic Wildlife Preservation Council's assessment team. They had come to document Roy's failure and recommend closure of the sanctuary. Instead, they found 3 healthy, well-adjusted razorbacks living in spacious enclosures with environmental enrichment. They found Roy, lean and weathered but clearly thriving, working with the hatchlings on advanced training that most experts would have said was impossible. The assessment team watched Roy recall all 3 hatchlings from over a kilometer away with a single whistle. They watched him conduct medical examinations while the hatchlings cooperated willingly. They watched cooperative hunting exercises, where Roy and the hatchlings worked together to bring down Frostvale's dangerous prey. The team documented everything with growing amazement. Before leaving, the lead assessor made Roy an unexpected offer. There were dozens of dangerous creatures across the galaxy with nowhere to go. Smuggled animals, orphaned predators, species considered too aggressive for traditional conservation. Would Roy be willing to accept more? The sanctuary could become a refuge for creatures that would otherwise be euthanized. Roy looked at his 3 dragons, now massive and healthy and happy. He thought about all the scared, confused animals dying because nobody knew how to help them. He thought about his small shelter and limited resources. Then he thought about the vast empty spaces of Frostvale and the human ability to adapt to any challenge. He said yes. 2 years after Roy first walked into a sealed section with nothing but a sandwich, Frostvale had transformed. What started as 1 human and 3 hatchlings had become a legitimate sanctuary, housing 32 creatures from 17 different worlds. The prefab shelter was gone, replaced by a proper compound with heated buildings, medical facilities, and specialized enclosures for species with different needs. Roy was no longer alone either. He had hired 6 assistants, 5 humans who understood his methods, and 1 brave Pillaran veterinarian named Dr. Lesh, who wanted to learn everything Roy knew. The humans came from similar backgrounds to Roy, people who had worked with dangerous Earth predators and understood that patience mattered more than technology. Together, they were proving that Roy's success with the hatchlings was not luck or some unique human gift. It was a method that could be taught and repeated. Each new creature that arrived brought new challenges. A pack of Voltar ice stalkers, considered completely untrainable by their homeworld's wildlife control, learned to trust through the same patience Roy had shown the hatchlings. A juvenile Titan worm, rescued from an illegal fighting ring, slowly healed from trauma that ran deeper than any physical wound. A family of crimson raptors displaced when their habitat was destroyed for mining found safe territory in Frostvale's southern forests. Every success reinforced Roy's philosophy. Most dangerous creatures were not evil or broken. They were scared, confused, or defending themselves. Given time, consistency, and respect, even the most aggressive predator could learn to coexist peacefully. The key was never forgetting what they were capable of while still treating them with dignity. Red, Ash, and Midnight were now fully grown Drakmor razorbacks, each weighing over 1,000 pounds with wingspans of 15 feet. They were magnificent and terrifying, apex predators that could tear through reinforced steel if they wanted, but they were also gentle with the sanctuary's smaller residents, patient with new arrivals, and protective of the humans they had bonded with. They had become ambassadors for their species, living proof that even the most dangerous creatures could thrive when given understanding instead of fear. The sanctuary's reputation spread across the galaxy. When facilities faced dangerous animal problems, they contacted Frostvale. When conservation programs had creatures they could not handle, they sent them to Roy. Scientists came to study his methods. Students came to learn his techniques. Frostvale became known as the place where impossible cases became success stories. Dr. Wex relocated permanently to establish a research station. Her published papers on human-animal bonding techniques sparked fierce debate in xenobiology circles. Traditional experts claimed humans were simply lucky, or that Roy was a unique case. But the data was impossible to ignore. A 94% success rate with creatures other facilities could not manage. No serious injuries to staff in 2 years. Multiple species learning complex behaviors that experts said was impossible. Roy began accepting students for formal training programs. Most were humans drawn by stories of Earth's newest pioneer, but some aliens attended too, willing to challenge their species' assumptions about handling dangerous creatures. The training was intense. Students spent months learning to read subtle body language, understand predator psychology, and develop patience that went beyond simple waiting. Many failed. Those who succeeded joined the sanctuary's growing staff. The most important lesson Roy taught was also the simplest. Respect was not given, it was earned. That applied whether you were working with a dragon or talking to another sentient being. Control through force created resentment and fear. Partnership through trust created loyalty and cooperation. The difference seemed small in theory but was massive in practice. Then came the distress call that would test everything Roy had built. A mining colony on the edge of explored space reported attacks by something massive and aggressive. Colonial defense forces had failed to stop it. The description matched a Drakmor razorback, but much larger than normal. An adult, possibly injured or sick, definitely traumatized. The colony wanted it dead within 48 hours or they would call in military forces. Roy knew he needed to try saving it. He packed medical supplies, food, and equipment for extended field work. Then he did something that surprised even his staff. He brought Red, Ash, and Midnight with him. If any creatures could help him approach a rogue razorback, it was them. The mining colony was chaos when they arrived. The rogue had claimed an entire section of the facility, attacking anything that approached. It was massive, easily 50% larger than Red, and covered in scars that told stories of violence and abuse. Colony security had tried tranquilizers, nets, and sonic weapons. Nothing worked. The creature was too traumatized, too angry, too broken by whatever it had endured. Roy studied the situation through security footage. He saw patterns in the attacks that confirmed his suspicions. This razorback had been used in fighting rings, trained through pain and fear to be violent. Undoing that conditioning would require time they did not have, and trust the creature had no reason to give. But Roy had advantages that previous handlers lacked. He had 3 adult razorbacks who could speak their own language. He sent Red, Ash, and Midnight ahead while he followed at a distance. The 3 approached the rogue's territory cautiously, calling out with vocalizations Roy had never heard them use before. Complex trills and rumbles that carried meaning in ways human language could not. The rogue emerged from hiding, massive and scarred, ready to fight. Then it saw Red, Ash, and Midnight sitting calmly, not attacking, not threatening. The rogue hesitated. These were not the usual enemies. These were kin. The rogue called back, a sound full of pain and confusion. Why were these others not fighting? Why were they here? Red responded with sounds that Roy understood emotionally, even if he could not translate them. Safety, family, home. The rogue took a cautious step forward. Ash and Midnight remained calm, their body language open and non-threatening. Roy stayed back, letting the razorbacks communicate in ways he could never replicate. Over 30 hours, Roy watched his 3 convince the rogue that not everything in the universe wanted to hurt it. They shared food. They groomed each other's scales. They slept in a protective circle with the rogue in the center. Roy approached only after the rogue had accepted Red, Ash, and Midnight completely. Even then he moved slowly, offering food and patience, asking nothing in return. When Roy finally touched the scarred snout of the rogue razorback, the colony's security team watched in stunned silence. This creature had terrorized trained soldiers for weeks. Now it was leaning into a human's hand like a pet seeking affection. The rogue was male, probably 8 years old, with scars from fighting rings covering his entire body. Roy named him Scar, a simple acknowledgement of what he had survived. The journey back to Frost Vale took days because Scar needed frequent stops to process his new reality. A world without pain, without forced violence, without fear. Red, Ash, and Midnight never left his side, showing him through constant presence that this was real and permanent. Roy watched the 4 razorbacks together and felt pride mixed with sadness. Scar's recovery would take years, but he would recover because he was finally safe. The mining colony sent a donation large enough to fund the sanctuary for 5 years. They also sent a formal message to the Galactic Wildlife Preservation Council, recommending that Roy's methods be studied and implemented across all member worlds. The message noted that humanity's approach to dangerous species was not weakness, but sophisticated strength that the galaxy had failed to recognize. 5 years after walking into danger with a sandwich, Roy Fisher was no longer an anonymous maintenance worker. He was a recognized expert in interspecies relations, a pioneer in animal rehabilitation, and the founder of the most successful dangerous species sanctuary in known space. But when people asked how he accomplished the impossible, his answer never changed. He did not tame anything. He did not control anything. He offered respect, patience, and food. He treated dangerous creatures with the dignity they deserved, while never forgetting what they were capable of. He learned from them as much as he taught them. The rest was just time and consistency, the same things humans had used to coexist with Earth's predators for thousands of years. On Frost Vale's observation deck, Roy stood watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Red, Ash, Midnight, and Scar were sprawled nearby, dozing in the fading warmth. A new transport was landing in the distance, bringing another creature the galaxy had deemed too dangerous to live. Roy could see the fear and hope in equal measure from here. He grabbed his pack, checking that his supplies were ready. Medical equipment, specialized food, and yes, a carefully prepared sandwich. Not because sandwiches were magic, but because sharing food was the universal language of peace. He walked toward the landing pad while 4 massive razorbacks stood and followed. They were family, and family protected each other. Another scared creature would learn tonight that not everything in the universe wanted to hurt it. Another impossible case would become a success story. And somewhere on worlds Roy would never visit, people would hear about the human who saved monsters with patience and realize that maybe, just maybe, there were better solutions than violence to every problem. The galaxy was beginning to understand what Roy had always known. Compassion was not weakness. Understanding was not surrender. And sometimes the most powerful weapon against fear and aggression was simply offering someone a sandwich and treating them with kindness until they remembered how to be kind themselves.